and welcome to another ASMR video here on the channel. Now today, finally, we are bringing back the history videos. It's been some time. I honestly can't even think back to the last time that we did film one. I can't even remember what the last one was. Maybe the Falklands War. You'll have to let me know. But obviously this is one of the staples here on the channel. We do a bit of research and then we take a slow, whispered, hopefully relaxing look and hopefully informative into various events and time periods throughout history. We've done a lot of the big hitters so far, so go and check them out. Link in the description to all my playlists on my channel. But if you do have any suggestions for future complex events, periods that you'd like to see covered, then comment them down below. Today we are covering the American Civil War, and that's because it was heavily requested by quite a few of you, so thank you for everyone who commented and suggested this. I've done my research, so we're gonna basically break it down into three sections. We're gonna look at the timeline of events, we're gonna look at the significance, and then we're also going to, I've got an article which is like 10 surprising facts you may or may not have known about the US Civil War. So, yeah, a lot to get through. So, without further ado, let's get into the US Civil War. So, let's begin first with the timeline of events. So, the timeline below provides some of the key events in the build-up to the outbreak of fighting in April 1861, as well as important moments in the conflict itself. In 1774, Rhode Island abolishes slavery. On the 13th of June that same year, Rhode Island becomes the first of the original 13 colonies to introduce anti-slavery laws that would accentuate the divide between northern and southern states. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence. On the 4th of July, Thomas Jefferson draws up the Declaration of Independence to assert the sovereign rights of the American colonists. In approving the Declaration, Congress set a precedent that outlined the rights of a people to abandon their former political allegiances and to institute a new government. In 1793 we have the cotton gin. In April that year, Eli Whitney's invention revolutionises cotton production in the South, eventually leading to cotton succeeding tobacco as the most profitable trade commodity in the United States. On the 30th of April 1803, we have the Louisiana Purchase. The Western Territories, a vast expanse of land stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific, are acquired by the United States from France for over $11 million. Several decades of debate and compromise over slavery's expansion westwards follow. On the 1st of January 1808, we have the abolishment of slave importation. The United States bans the import and export of slaves 1 year after Great Britain abolished the slave trade. Northern states begin a gradual process of ending slavery, but the institution strengthens in the South as cotton production expands. The internal trade grows as northern owners sell their slaves, creating what historians have labelled a second Middle Passage within America. In 1820, on the 3rd of March, we have the Missouri Compromise. Since the beginning of the 19th century, the political balance between North and South had been maintained by admitting alternately slave and free states. The more populous North had come to dominate the House of Representatives, and the South now sought to redress the balance. Missouri is admitted to the Union as a slave state, but in the future, states north of Missouri and the 3630 latitude line would be admitted only if they were free, except for California, which was admitted to the Union in 1850 as a free state, despite the parallel divide. 18th of September 1850 brings the Fugitive Slave Act. Congress is denied interference in the slave trade between states, enabling Southern slave owners to take free blacks from the North. The act galvanizes abolitionists as it implicated free states in maintaining the slave system by including clauses that meant anyone aiding runaway slaves would be subject to fines and imprisonment. Many abolitionist tracts and slave narratives make reference to the act to highlight Northern complicity towards the institution of slavery. One famous example from 1852 was Mary Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which gained tremendous readership and publicity for the abolitionist cause. Now, 1854 to 1856, we have the conflict over Kansas. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act overturns the Missouri Compromise by ceding rights to individual states to decide whether to be free or slave-holding through the process of popular sovereignty. Slaveholders flock into Kansas to secure their allegiance, sparking clashes with Free State Northerners on a scale that threatens civil war. In August to October 1858, we have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In Illinois, Democrat Stephen A. Douglas and Republican Abraham Lincoln engage in 7 debates during the Senate election campaign. Their speeches were circulated beyond the state and serve as a nuanced discussion of the problem of slavery and its future. Although he lost the election, much of what Lincoln said in the debates went on to form his presidential campaign in 1860. 16th to the 18th of October 1859, we have a raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown attempts to lead an armed slave insurrection by seizing a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He believes slavery could only be ended by violent means. The raid sparked a national outcry both for and against Brown's actions. Contemporary Southern accounts blamed the recently formed Republican Party and their anti-slavery platform for inspiring the violence. US Marines, under the command of future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, suppressed the insurrectionists. Brown was caught and sentenced to death, his hanging witnessed by Abraham Lincoln's assassinator John Wilkes Booth. This event is often seen as the last notable flashpoint of sectional tension before the outbreak of all-out civil war. On the 6th of November 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. Republican Party candidate Abraham Lincoln becomes the 16th president of the United States. He wins the presidential election without carrying a single Southern vote. In that same year, on the 20th of December, South Carolina secedes. South Carolina, one of the richest states in the country, is the first to secede in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's election. The Ordinance of Secession cites Northern hostility to slavery and the election of a sectional party as reasons for the state's action. From January to February 1861, we have the extension of secession and the formation of the Confederacy. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all commit to secession in 1861. These states form the Confederate States of America, elect Jefferson Davis as their president and draft a constitution which mimics that of the United States, except for an explicit endorsement of slavery. On the 4th of March 1861, Lincoln's first inaugural address, Lincoln calls for peace with the erring seceding states, stating that though passions may have strained, the North and South must not be enemies but friends. Appealing to the better angels of our nature in an attempt to pacify growing concerns about a possible conflict, he declares, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." He argues that the Union is perpetual and must be maintained. On the 12th of April 1861, we have Fort Sumter. The first exchange of fire in the Civil War takes place off the coast of South Carolina at Fort Sumter, a garrison that had been occupied by Kentuckian Unionists. Lincoln, under public pressure, sends provisions to the previously unmanned garrison and notifies the secessionists of his intentions. Jefferson Davis takes the decision to fire on the unarmed boat, which leads to the surrender and evacuation of the Federal troops. And just a few days later, on the 15th of April, Lincoln summons the troops. Lincoln calls on the northern states to supply a 75,000-strong militia that would serve for 3 months, enough time, he believes, to restore the Union. Lincoln justifies this resort to force by stating that the issue had become too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. That day, minor skirmishes occur in western Virginia. On the 17th of April to the 21st of May, 1861, border states secede. I really hope I'm saying that word right. Hostilities at Fort Sumter force Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina to side with the Confederacy. As the Confederacy expands, Jefferson Davis struggles to maintain social unity, its members seceding in order to assert their individual rights. For the rest of the conflict, Lincoln fights to hold on to the remaining border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. On the 21st of July, we have the first Battle of Bull Run. The first major battle of the Civil War occurs when public and political demands push an unprepared Union army into battle in Virginia. The arrival of Confederate reinforcements ensures a Confederate victory and a rapid retreat to Washington, D.C. for the Union Army. On the 8th of November 1861, the Trent Affair. British public opinion is divided over the Civil War, but economic ties with America are strong, and the British are keen to regain an influence in the New World. 2 Confederate commissioners on their way to persuade the British to support the Southern cause are halted by a Union naval commander. Britain reacts strongly, threatening a war that neither Britain nor the Union wants, but is eventually appeased by Union efforts. Moving into 1862, on the 17th of July, we have the enlisting of black soldiers. The 37th Congress approves of the enrolment of black troops in the Union militias out of a compulsion to use all the physical force at their disposal. This constitutes a marked departure from a policy of turning away black soldiers keen to enlist. In that same year, from the 28th to the 30th of August, we have the Second Battle of Bull Run. Generals Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee defeat the Union Army and send them back to Washington, D.C. once more. On the 17th of September 1862, the Battle of Antietam. The bloodiest day of the Civil War is militarily inconclusive, but pivotal for the Union cause. An offer from Britain and France to mediate a peace on the basis of Confederate independence is dropped. Lincoln, who had been waiting for such a propitious moment of Union advantage, issues a preliminary emancipation proclamation on 22nd of September. He warns the Confederacy that he would order slave emancipation unless the rebelling states returned to the Union by the new year. And on the 1st of January, 1863, we have the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that slaves inside the rebelling Confederacy were thenceforward and forever free, applying to over 3 million of the approximately 4 million slaves in the whole of America at the time of the conflict. The proclamation only applied to the Confederacy, not the slave states still in the Union or the areas under Union Army authority. Emancipation would not be granted until 1865. The proclamation added the abolition of slavery to Lincoln's goal of reuniting the Union. On 3rd of March 1863, the First Conscription Act, the nation's first conscription act, is passed by Congress. The wealthy take advantage of a $300 exemption fee to avoid serving. 1st to the 3rd of July 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, in an attempt to bring the Southern cause to the north, invades Pennsylvania but is routed by the Union Army. Lee fails to capitalize on early military advantages, leading an infantry charge to a decisive defeat. Both sides are exhausted. The Union fails to press advantage as Lee retreats. Confederate forces are kept out of Union territory for the rest of the war. And then on the 4th of July 1863, we have the Siege of Vicksburg. General Ulysses S. Grant reverses his ailing fortunes at Vicksburg, Mississippi, risking separation from his supply lines in order to exploit a Confederate vulnerability. The maneuver and subsequent siege is successful, and Grant splits the Confederate army the day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. From 13th to the 16th of July that same year, New York City draft riots. The arrival of draft officers in New York City spurs rioting. In the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, tensions rise amongst the urban poor in the north as they fear competition for work when the newly freed slaves migrate. There is also dislike about the war being centered on abolition instead of Union preservation. Working class and mostly Irish men in New York, already frustrated with a severe fall in wages, refuse to be drafted to fight, and 3 days of violent protest break out, particularly targeting black citizens and Republican newspapers. Troops from Gettysburg are sent to the city to restore order. On the 19th of November 1863, the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln arrives at Gettysburg to speak at the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg War Dead. The speech is only 2 minutes long, makes strong reference to the language of the Declaration of Independence, and emphasises the unity of the nation. Later that year, Lincoln offers amnesty to Confederate soldiers who will pledge loyalty to the Union. On the 2nd of September 1864, we have the capture of Atlanta. Under General William Sherman's command, the Union Army captured the Confederate stronghold of Atlanta and embarked on a campaign of destruction aimed at breaking the will of the Confederate Army. On the 8th of November 1864, Lincoln is re-elected. Military successes strengthen Lincoln's election campaign against the dovish Democrat General George McClellan. Lincoln is re-elected, carrying the Electoral College vote and a slim majority of the popular vote. Moving into 1865, from January to February, Fort Fisher and the last days of the Confederacy. Union forces capture Fort Fisher in North Carolina, strengthening a Union blockade, which has caused devastating food and clothing shortages in the South. Laws against conspiracy are tightened and habeas corpus suspended in order to stop Confederate desertions. Jefferson Davis even makes a desperate bid to arm the slaves which is rejected by his Congress. On the 9th of April 1865, surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Union reinforcements arrive at the Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and secure General Lee's surrender. This marks the effective end of the Civil War. And then on the 14th of April 1865, in an attempt to throw the Union into electoral chaos, a group of Confederate sympathizers from Maryland plot to assassinate President Lincoln, his Vice President and Secretary of War. Lincoln is shot in his box at the Ford Theatre in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth and dies early the next morning. His secretaries escape a similar fate. The conspirators are arrested and hanged. Andrew Johnson becomes president. And finally, on the 18th of December 1865, the 13th Amendment is ratified. After a great deal of political wrangling, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery is ratified. Well, that brings the timeline of events to an end. So, as I said, what we're going to take a little look at now is a little article which basically discusses the cost and the significance of the Civil War. So, above and beyond its superior naval forces, numbers, and industrial and financial resources, the triumph of the North was partly due to the statesmanship of Lincoln, who by 1864 had become a masterful political and war leader, as well as to the increasing skill of federal officers. The victory can also be attributed in part to failures of Confederate transportation, material, and political leadership, despite the strategic and tactical dexterity of such generals as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Joseph E. Johnson. While desertions plagued both sides, the personal valour and the enormous casualties, both in absolute numbers and in percentage of numbers engaged, have not yet ceased to astound scholars and military historians. On the basis of the 3-year standard enlistment, about 1,556,000 soldiers served in the federal armies, and about 800,000 men probably served in the Confederate forces, though spotty records make it impossible to know for sure. Traditionally, historians have put war deaths at about 360,000 for the Union and 260,000 for the Confederates. In the second decade of the 21st century, however, a demographer used better data and more sophisticated tools to convincingly revise the total death toll upward to 752,000 and indicated that it could be well over 800,000. The enormous death rate, roughly 2% of the 1860s population of the US, died in the war. That is crazy. This had an enormous impact on American society. Americans were deeply religious, and they struggled to understand how a benevolent God could allow such destruction to go on for so long. Understanding of the nature of the afterlife shifted as Americans north and south comforted themselves with the notion that heaven looked like their front parlours. A new mode of dealing with corpses emerged with the advent of embalming, an expensive method of preservation that helped wealthier families to bring their dead sons, brothers, or fathers home. Finally, a network of federal military cemeteries grew out of the need to bury the men in uniform who had succumbed to wounds or disease. Some have called the American Civil War the last of the old-fashioned wars. Others have termed it the first modern war. Actually, it was a transitional war, and it had a profound impact technologically on the development of modern weapons and techniques. There were many innovations. It was the first war in history in which ironclad warships clashed, the first in which the telegraph and railroad played significant roles, Generals, the first to use extensively rifled ordnance and shell guns, and to introduce a machine gun, the first to have widespread newspaper coverage, voting by servicemen in the field in national elections, and photographic recordings, the first to organise medical care of troops systematically, bloody nor it's still going, and the first to use land and water mines, and to employ a submarine that could sink a warship. Oh, there's one more. And it was also the first war in which armies widely employed aerial reconnaissance by means of balloons. The Civil War has been written about as few other wars in history have. More than 60,000 books and countless articles give eloquent testimony to the accuracy of poet Walt Whitman's prediction that a great literature will arise out of the era of those 4 years. The events of the war left a rich heritage for future generations, and that legacy was summed up by the martyred Lincoln as showing that the reunited section of the United States constituted the last best hope of Earth. Well, some great words there. Coming into this, I had I knew the basics of the American Civil War, but I highly recommend you read into it more yourselves. Obviously, I'm summarising massively here. There are so many interesting specific events, and I thoroughly enjoyed doing this research, and I recommend you do the same because it's a very interesting topic. Anyways, we're going to round off this video with 10 surprising facts now about the US Civil War. So some of these we may have already covered, but I thought this would be pretty interesting to go through just to finish off. So here we go. Fact number 1. 1/3 of the soldiers who fought for the Union Army were immigrants, and nearly 1 in 10 was African American. I find that so ironic and so funny that when the Confederacy were on the ropes, they were literally fighting to maintain slavery, but who did they call upon when they were in need? The slaves. Just shows how desperate they got. Fact number 2. Black Union soldiers refused their salaries for 18 months to protest being paid lower wages than white soldiers. Harriet Tubman led a raid to free slaves during the Civil War. Harriet Tubman, the escaped slave who led others to freedom on the Underground Railroad before the war, arrived at the Union camp at Port Royal, South Carolina, in the spring of 1862 to support the Union cause. She began teaching freed slave women skills that could earn them wages with the Union Army, but soon she was gathering intelligence about the countryside from the freed slaves and taking river reconnaissance trips. On June 1st, 1863, Tubman and Union Colonel James Montgomery steamed into the interior with 300 black Union soldiers. The troops swept through nearby plantations, burning homes and barns as Union gunboats sounded their whistles. Slave men, women and children came streaming from the countryside, reminding Tubman of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. More than 720 slaves were shuttled to freedom during the mission. In the first raid led by a woman during the Civil War, Tubman liberated 10 times the number of slaves she had freed in 10 years on the Underground Railroad. I really can't say that road, railroad. What an incredible story. That really sounds like that could be a plot for a film. There probably is a film about it. If there is, let me know, because that would be awesome. That's not the plot of 12 Years a Slave, is it? A film I'm ashamed to say I've never watched. Fact number 4. Abraham Lincoln was shot at and almost killed nearly 2 years before he was actually assassinated. Fact 5. Before William Tecumseh Sherman became a great Union general, he was demoted for apparent insanity. General Ulysses S. Grant wasn't the bloodiest general of the war. Robert E. Lee was. Apparently, he was responsible for twice the number of casualties. Both before and during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln pushed to send freed slaves abroad. Robert E. Lee's Virginia estate was confiscated by the Union and turned into a cemetery during the war. Fact number 9. Privates weren't cannon fodder during the Civil War. Generals were. Good fodder. And the final fact is more men died in the Civil War than any other American conflict, and 2/3 of the dead perished from disease. Some very interesting facts there, but that does round up our ASMR history video on the US Civil War. I really hope you did enjoy it. As I said, I really enjoyed looking into it, and hopefully you found it informative as well as relaxing. If you did enjoy it, please do leave a like on this video. It really does help the channel out. And even better, if you're new, consider